Today on the SSDA Soundwave, we've joined by Josh Newman, former state senator and chair of the Senate Education Committee, and now a candidate for California State Superintendent of Public Instruction. Over his legislative career, Josh has focused on issues central to small and rural school districts, from facilities and funding equity to staffing challenges and accountability reform. He was a principal co-author of Proposition 2, which provides billions of school modernization and repair dollars, including key provisions to support small and rural communities. In this episode, we'll dive into his vision for the future of California's education, the field of education, and his approach to local control and how he plans to ensure that rural school districts are not left behind. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Well, I got to tell you that I'm just done a couple of these, and so this is a new venture for me to do a podcast. But I think it's very important for our small and rural communities for our small school districts to get a little bit of content from us in a podcast form, right?
You and I both have podcasts, and both of us are trailing behind our friend Bodie Gower, who's like 20 years old. He's got a following of
Bodie is amazing. Yeah. I had the opportunity to spend a little time with him in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago, advocating for secure rural schools. You know, he's at Georgetown now.
Right.
And so he supported us. We took FFA students from 8 different states to advocate for secure rural schools. So it was a lot of fun. A lot of good stuff, right?
Right.
So Josh, you are running for state superintendent. We've had the opportunity, we've crossed paths a couple of times. You've spoken at some of our conferences. You have a lot of valuable material and information to share with folks. Got you to take on this crazy challenge of wanting to run the state CDE, right? And
when you put it that way, it sounds even more daunting than it is. So Yuri, I actually had the privilege of serving in the state Senate from 2016 to 2024. And as you mentioned, the last 2 years, I was the chair of the Senate Committee on Education. And over those 2 years, presided over 500 bills that came through the committee, did some good legislative work on my own around education, especially around recess and dual enrollment and mental health stuff, and gained a real appreciation, I think, for just how vast California's K through 12 education system is and how complex. And so we have, what I would describe as a real systems alignment challenge in California, where you have 58 counties, 977 different school districts, 300 of which are, you remember, small school districts, 10,000 schools, 5.8 million students across all these schools. And they're all, there are so many different models, and our system generally relies on a kind of a one-size-fits-all default format, which it's frankly not working, which I think is obvious, but the solutions are not nearly as obvious. And when it comes to small districts, as you and I have discussed, I'm always impressed that one, small districts tend to do more with less. 2, they are as challenged as anybody because of this one-size-fits-all approach. And the third thing, which I think is really important, is in those districts that have figured out how to get more done against some real challenges, there are real lessons for the rest of the system. And I'd like, as superintendent, both to support those small districts better, but also to use them as the basis for the kind of innovation and replication that we need if we're really going to improve public education in California.
Well, you've hit a lot of topics there. And one of the things that I go around the state talking about is the perfect gardens or perfect vehicles for innovation and in our small communities. And unfortunately, the state has challenged us with a lot of mandated planning and mandated reporting and things that we've talked about previously that in many cases, nobody ever even reads. And so as state superintendent, how would you tackle this growing volume of bureaucracy that we've created for small school districts that takes superintendents and staff out of the classroom, out of educating kids, out of focusing curriculum, and puts them back in a back office to write a plan or write a report that nobody's going to read?
Right. It's funny. I think last year I had a meeting with a group of superintendents from my area. They're probably 25, 30 superintendents from the Orange County, LA area. And they brought with them a whole bunch of these bankers boxes, right, to illustrate, I think, visually, concretely, like just how much paperwork they're saddled with. And I think the term somebody used was the plandemic, right? There's just so much compliance work. and these aren't, for the most part, these are medium to, large size districts. They're challenged. So imagine if you're a small district, you have limited resources, limited staff, the bureaucratic burden that we've sort of imposed on these schools. And I always come back to data, right? Which is, it should not be that hard to assess the performance of a school or a school district in ways that don't necessarily entail, kind of old school paperwork. I mean, this is a relic of the pre-digital age, but we haven't figured out how to move beyond it. And if we could get to a point where we had, some baseline metrics we agreed upon for performance, we could then grant to districts of all sizes, but especially small districts, additional latitude, more flexibility that assumes that they are doing their work, they're doing it well, but also takes into account that they have limited resources. And in so doing, free them up to return to the really important work of actually educating students. And your point is well taken. And all my experience with small districts validates this, which is, you have in a small district, you have people wearing multiple hats. And the more paperwork you assign them, the less they can do that actually impacts not just their students, but the families in those communities as well. And so we need to recognize that, not just in small districts, but small districts, I think, are the best, as you said, kind of laboratory for figuring this out. And if we could focus on what's really important, which is educating California's public school students to be, well prepared for the workforce of the future, to be good critical thinkers, to be civic participants. But if administrators and educators are forced to deal with bureaucracy all the time, we're not going to do that.
Very good points, Josh. And the challenge I see with that is in figuring out how to restructure the system. I mean, as I look at the bills that come out of the legislature, as I look at the governor's proposed budget and all the things that are added, as opposed to just putting into the base funding formula, right? It's like we're moving back to categorical programs, which creates this system of bureaucracy, right? The planning and the reporting but how do you go about reforming that? That's part of the entire system, and which CD is a part of, but so is the legislature and the governor's office and all these programs that we're creating.
Well, as a former legislator, and I guess I was at the center of a lot of this, and the natural impulse among elected people is to introduce new ideas that generally become programs, and those programs typically have a compliance aspect, right? If you're giving money out, you're going to make sure that it's properly used. But we haven't really, to your point, given enough thought to, we keep adding layers and layers and layers of complexity, right? So now we have essentially the worst of both worlds. We've got an emphasis on local control through LCFF, and then, as you mentioned, every new program seems to, come in, kind of categorically, and so additional funding, if it's offset by, the dilution that comes with all of this compliance, doesn't necessarily get you very far. And I think the truth is, our NAEP scores attest to this fact, right? We have doubled per capita student spending over the last 20 years in California, but we've seen a very marginal increase in performance on standardized tests they give not just to other states, but to the whole world. And our third grade reading levels, as an example, are just pitifully low. And so I think the lesson there is, if you keep doing the same thing over and over and it's not working, you should be open to new approaches. The other thing that I think is really alarming about the NAEP scores is the gap between high achievers and low achievers continues to grow, and those gaps tend to correlate with demographic and socioeconomic data as well. And so the answer is not additional categorical statewide programs. The answer is to figure out, how do we attend to each district in such a way that they can do their work and do it well. And then as they do it, we can measure their performance in a way that gives us some basis for accountability, but without limiting the flexibility that I think that educators need to address their particular needs in a given community.
One of the interesting things that I learned as I travel around and meet with different districts, and I do some governance training with boards, and districts have communities, I'll call them communities, have their own standards, right? That is the whole concept of local control. And so in some cases, the community may want to be very focused on test scores and achievement based on standardized testing. And in other communities, they're looking to teach their kids other values and other things that, and maybe a less of a focus on standardized testing. And you talked a little bit about how, accountability. And so it's kind of hard to figure out, how do you create a system of accountability, but allow districts to continue to have that local control, right? To have the ability to
Right.
teach the kids in the directions they want to go, right?
Right. Well, there's this kind of interesting phrase is are we measuring what we value, or are we simply valuing what we measure?
Exactly.
And
Right.
there are so many measures of achievement or quality, and not all of them tell you very much, frankly. And so, I always think it's good to get kind of work your way back to kind of the really basic questions. And to my mind, the really basic question is what do we want out of a public school graduate in California? And I think it's pretty straightforward, right? As I think I mentioned earlier, you want a young person who is ready to either go to college or participate fully in the local workforce. But we also want them to be well-rounded, critical thinkers, adaptable to a rapidly changing world. And then something I think is really important is I want them to be civically knowledgeable and ready to participate in local civic affairs. That's always been the standard. That's been sort of essential to kind of the American dream, the California dream. And we've gotten so far away from that as we've gotten so granular, as systems often do, as experts tend to kind of to do. So I think it's worth reconsidering. Like, are we doing this well, especially against that larger landscape, as I mentioned, which is we got giant schools in California. You got LAUSD, second largest district in the country, and then you have 330 something members of SSDA that are all smaller schools, up to 2,500 students. Those are so different, and they're in different parts of the state, different communities that have very different sensibilities. But again, it's not wrong to say, like, hey, every graduate should meet some standard, but that standard should be well defined and concise enough that it allows for flexibility that's appropriate to both the resources and the community. And I don't think that's that hard, but I think the thing that is so needed in Sacramento is an appreciation of that need and a willingness to kind of work deliberately toward it.
Josh, I have to update your figures. We have a record year of membership this year. We have 430 school district members.
Well, now I
So
guess
we're hitting record numbers this year. There are a total of 651 districts that are under 2,500 ADA.
well,
So
congratulations on that. I think
yeah,
I was
so
going
we're
off an
we're
old
getting
number.
close to hitting. I'm going to hit 100%. You know me, I set my goals, set my targets, and I'm going to get there.
Hey, that's great, but I think that does so. Over 2/3 of California's public school districts, meet those
Meet that
criteria,
requirement, right?
and and
And
so and so this is the challenge I think in Sacramento. Most of the power that is wielded in the legislature is by members who are from urban areas that,
urban areas.
unsurprisingly, have big districts. And so rhetorically, we talk about treating all districts equally, but we certainly haven't been doing that over the last 2 decades.
And many of those legislators have never visited a small rural school district, and so they are legislating based on what they know and what they're experiencing in an urban area. Josh, you mentioned a couple things I thought was super interesting, and there are a lot of districts now that are engaging in this exercise of a profile of a graduate,
Hmm.
and I thought what you mentioned was really important. Maybe we do need to redefine in California what our profile of a graduate is, right?
Hmm.
And communicate that, and then measure our districts, allow them to define their own profiles that are locally based, but have sort of a generic one at the state level that isn't just scores, right?
Totally, and I think part of the challenge here is doing two things at once, right? It's sort of administering the current system, flawed such as it is, but also working deliberately toward a different rubric and a different approach, and that is something that I think we haven't done a particularly good job at in the legislature, but kind of written larger, across all of the different stakeholders at the state level of SSPI, state board, governor's office, and the legislature. And then, there's all these subsidiary other, entities like the School Allocations Board and CCEE. All those things have to be part of this conversation that says, hey, let's admit that the status quo is less than perfect. I think I'm understating it, but let's work deliberately toward something, to my mind, that is not only straightforward, but would simplify the work of educators immeasurably, right? If we simply had a consensus and a standard that says, one, what's the profile of high school graduate? Two is, how do we assess that? How do we measure it over time? And if we could do that, then you have a really good basis for figuring out which districts do it well, which maybe aren't doing as well, and where it's not done well, let's hold them accountable. Let's put real pressure to improve. But where it's being done well, let's give them the autonomy and the flexibility to continue doing that, and let's learn from that, because I really do think, and I spent a lot of time in small districts. It is remarkable, right? And I'm not talking about the tiny district. I'm talking about some of your sort of upper end ones. 2,000 students or something. There are some wonderful educators doing amazing work, and that work could be used as the basis for extending those insights, those innovations into bigger systems, and we would all benefit.
I love it. So is that something you are thinking of leading, that type of an effort that
I mean,
brings
honestly,
all the
Yuri,
stakeholders together?
that is why I'm running, right? That is why I'm running. And I always tell people, like, I'm not that smart, but I'm smart enough to know where the smart people are doing good work. And if we could bring them together in a truly kind of collaborative and productive way, we could make real progress on improving education across California.
Josh, we moving to the funding topic of funding. SSDA has been advocating for some type of a supplemental LCFF grant for for small and rural communities. And the reason for that is that no matter how few students you have, there's an essential amount of money that's needed to run an educational system. And I've been told by many people that, that's not something that would gain any traction, because once you open that door, then every special interest group wants a supplement for whatever there are. But I think this is a real problem in California, and something that does need attention, whether it's through a supplemental formula for small and rural districts, or some other format. Our small and rural communities they're doing more with fewer resources, but some of those resources are so scarce that students are just not getting what they need to meet this profile of a graduate that you're talking about, meet those minimal elements of being a successful member of society, right?
Right.
So what do you think about that? What do you think about a supplemental formula for rurals, and is it something that is a possibility, or these naysayers thinking you've got a lot of legislative experience, right?
Well, so I guess I'd answer the question kind of along two lines. One is, it's really challenging. I mean, to your point, so the local control funding formula was initially implemented in 2013 through legislation that was passed in 2012. But just to get there took a couple of years, and it took a consensus building that recognized that, irrespective of Prop 98, we weren't necessarily getting resources to all these kind of disparate schools in ways that met their needs. But that was 12 years ago, and so, to your point, the LCFF formula is in need of revisiting, because the world has changed substantially in the last 12 years. It continues to change, and one of the things that has become, I think, very obvious is small districts are really challenged, because on a formulaic basis, the formula does not provide minimum resources to do really basic things. But can we reform LCFF? To do that, you have to kind of open up the treaty, as it were. But that doesn't mean that in the interim, because we should force those conversations. I would argue the SSPI, that is the role of the superintendent. It actually, the superintendent of public instruction actually has a very limited statutory amount of authority. In fact, basically none. And then in terms of his or her kind of impact on the budget, equally sort of diminished. But the position is really important, because it is the glue that holds these conversations together. Governor's office has the most impact. The governor proposes a budget every January. That budget gets modified over time, but that's where it starts. The legislature approves that budget. 50 years or so since we passed Prop 98, that's been the measure, which is, did the legislature meet its Prop 98 obligations, especially in a budget environment that's really challenged. And in doing that, we lose sight of these other larger questions. Somebody needs to advocate for all of these very obvious needs. And the governor could very well, even absent, I think, a necessary long-term approach to changing LCFF, you could put supplemental funds into, the ed budget as part of the Prop 98 increment, and make sure that, to your point, 2/3 of California's districts are small or rural districts. And so, even if that's a relatively small share of the 5.8 million students, all of these entities need to work. Otherwise, we are failing in our most basic obligation, which is you take an oath of office that says, you're going to do your job as well as you can. That's an obligation. Make sure that every student receives the sufficient amount of funding, guidance, support, resources to get a quality education in California. So, I don't have a problem with that, but I think it's going to take leadership, kind of in the legislative and executive sphere, to elevate this conversation and make sure that it's an important part of the allocation process in the budget.
As I'm thinking about this, these unfunded mandates that keep coming out of the legislature, right? And we talk about them in unfunded, and then there's the mandated block grant that goes out for unfunded mandates. But this places an enormous amount of pressure on small and rural communities because they're already stretching that dollar, and then they're asked to do more with the same amount of money. And I think that's a serious challenge. And is there a role for the state superintendent when the legislature is proposing these bills that are creating these additional unfunded mandates?
Well, there's a provision in California law that says, any piece of legislation that has a fiscal component needs to be funded, but it clearly it doesn't always happen. And so, yeah, I mean, so the state board and the SSBI should be part of all of those conversations, but and sort of the recurring theme should be simplicity, right? If the systems need to be clear, they need to be workable. And it's so easy. And, again, I had an interesting vantage point as a member of the legislature. It's so easy for the legislature to pass, 1,000 bills a year, of which, some fairly large number have some implications for education. And the irony is, in theory, there's a process that, the appropriations process is supposed to say, hey, a bill adds a fiscal burden to the state. We should or shouldn't do it. We should be equally attentive. Does a bill add a fiscal or administrative burden to a district? And if it does, I think that has to be considered. And then, the totality of this here, as you mentioned, is we start from a starting point where districts are already severely burdened, and we're adding to that burden where the legislative and policy goal should be reduce that burden, increase flexibility and autonomy, ensure accountability, but in so doing, give administrators the freedom to make good choices and fiscal allocations that let them do their work, right? And then we'll hold them to account if we can assess. I mean, the truth is, it's not that hard. We live in a world of data. It shouldn't be that hard to not only assess districts across the state, but school sites as well. I mean, not really that hard. A bunch of different ways probably to do it. And if you did that objectively, then it starts to free you up, I think, to give people a little more freedom.
Josh, you should be applauded for co-authoring Proposition 2. I mean, that's, I think, the first time in the history of the state that money has been set aside for facilities for small school districts.
Right.
And as you know, the funding formula under the state facilities program is so skewed towards large school districts that in many cases, rural communities can't access the money at all, either because they don't have the tax base, they don't have the ability to pass a bond, or just the size of the facilities. I mean, we were talking about Mountain Empire, which I believe you're going to visit here soon. Mountain Empire's high school needs $100 million worth of renovations,
Right.
just to bring it up to a standard that every student in California deserves, right?
Right.
And when
Right.
you look at that amount of money, a small community has a really hard time raising a match, or even in some senses getting into a hardship program because of the way the formula is structured. We appreciate very much the set aside in Proposition 2, but what efforts would you have to continue to reform the whole, the whole state facilities program to make it a little bit more fair for small and rural communities to access some of these state funds?
So I was, one of the legislative members to the school allocations board, which actually hears and then approves grant applications for funding. And so as of the end of 2024, we had no money. That's why Prop 2 was so necessary. And so Prop 2 allocates $8.5 billion for K through 12, $1.5 billion for community colleges. But one thing that I think people don't consider is, rural and small school districts often are some of the oldest districts in the state. In many cases, those that's why there's so many. Those boundaries predate the municipalities that grew up around them. So no surprise they have some of the oldest facilities. And so $8.5 billion sounds like a lot of money, but much of that money is already accounted for, in sort of pending applications for which there wasn't sufficient funding prior to the bond passing. And so the question is, how do we make sure that small districts have a fair shot at the funds they need? So, one, $8.5 billion isn't nearly enough. I mean, across the state, and two, to this larger conversation, smaller districts are really challenged. They don't have dedicated staff to do the kinds of things that big districts can do. For instance, writing grant applications. And so, when you think of the facilities master plan requirement for submission to the SAB as part of the grant process, that's a full-time job, right? So thankfully, you can use AI and some other things to kind of work around that. But we need to be honest about that. So the schools that are in most need, in most desperate need of the support and the investments, are often at the biggest disadvantage when it comes time for competing for these funds. So we need to recognize that. I think we did some good work in Prop 2 in accounting for that, but we have to do more. And to your point, you often don't have the tax base, but just importantly, you often don't have the political sort of audience for passing bond measures in these small districts that are challenged in so many ways already. So I think we have to be honest about that. And over time, I think there's a need to be more ambitious when it comes to allocating and finding the funds to make these big investments if we're serious about improving education in California. I don't know if your listeners know much about my checkered past. I got recalled in 2018 for voting for SB1, which was it was the gas tax increase, and I don't regret that vote. We've done a lot of good work. That gas tax has raised $40 billion that otherwise was not available for desperately needed investments in California's transportation infrastructure. We need to do something similar for schools in California. And when you think about the deferred maintenance, but also the lead pipes, the lack of potable water in certain districts, that is an indictment. And I think many people are surprised, especially in urban areas, to find out there are places in California where kids are going to school where they don't have access to clean water during the school day. That doesn't sound like the California that we aspire to. And that should not be allowed to continue.
And Josh, we've talked about this before, and there are 14 districts that have reached out to me with issues related to wells or their water systems, and that they have to bring in water bottles for kids because they don't have clean water. And 14 is a big number for a state like California that's supposed to be one of the largest economies in the world. So it doesn't make sense to me.
Not at all.
We should be able to fix that problem.
But I think this is the point. So, those 14 schools should not have to wait in line. They should not have to compete, with everybody else for some share of that, of that Prop 2 money. That should be job one, where we say, like, the basic standard in California is clean water, a workable school environment, an HVAC system that works. All of
clean and working restrooms.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. But the cost of that is billions and billions. And the state has the resources. We just need to have the will and the political process to make that happen.
Well, and that's why, we're very grateful for the $770 million that's set aside, but out of that, modernization is, 350, 400 million. And when you see one school has a need of $100 million for their high school, the amount of money the amount of districts that's going to help, it can be very small, right?
Right.
Any kind of minor repair is, a handful of $1 million or $10 million. That money's going to dry up pretty fast.
Well, and to your point, like, you can't build a half a high school, right? You can't say, like, hey, I know you need 100 million. We're going to give you 10, build a tenth of a high school. That $10 million doesn't solve the problem.
It doesn't work. Yeah.
It doesn't work at all. But that's a high school with, probably 600-700 students they've been making it work, and I give, that principal and that superintendent a lot of credit, but it's not fair. Right. It's not fair to the students, and we shouldn't allow it to happen.
All right. I know we're running out of time here, Josh, but I wanted to ask you kind of a question. Looking 4 years ahead, right? what's the single measure by which you'd want to small and rural superintendents to judge your success as a state superintendent?
So I will say, and I don't think you'll disagree, and I've talked to lots and lots of your members. I want to see a situation where the superintendent and the California Department of Education are collaborative partners and assistive resources to every single district in the state. The current situation is it's not perceived that way, right? The perception of CDE is hard to reach, very big on compliance, but not real big on support or collaboration. So that would be the first measure, which is I'd like to change that relationship and the culture within CDE. And part of that is to make sure that of the 1,500 or so people within the California Department of Education, there should be a group that is solely dedicated to serving small and rural districts, to making sure that you get you have a full partner and you get a quick response. And we are more creative and collaborative in solving these problems. Secondly, again, I'd like to work toward a goal of an agreed upon set of metrics that let us assess the quality of education and the quality of outcomes, and reduce both subjectivity and bureaucracy, as we've discussed. And if we could do that, I think you'd have a much better basis for both identifying excellence, but also enforcing standards. And so, that to me, and to say that is one thing; to do it is actually a hard thing. This is an immensely complex system, but we have the resources, and I think there are some really good people within CDE that, if given the chance, would rise to the occasion. And I know there are some awesome superintendents and administrators and educators across the state, especially in rural districts, that would welcome that partnership. And so my job as SPI, I think, is to foster a new approach that allows for a change in culture that allows us to do those things.
Big task, my friend. Josh, thank you so much for joining me. I know you have a podcast. I hope my podcast lives up to
your podcast is
expectations.
It's way better than my cast, but we're all aspiring to be Bodie Gower.
Exactly. We're all aspiring to be Bodie Gower.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being with us. Yeah,
thank you.